Welcome to Footsteps of Empires. Today we explore the story of the Battle of Megiddo, where ancient war, courage, and strategy began. The scent of myrrh still clung to the funeral linens when Pharaoh Thutmoses III ascended the throne, alone at last. But though Queen Hatshepsut's body had been laid to rest in the Valley of the Kings, her influence refused to die. Her obelisks still pierced the Theban sky, her inscriptions still adorned the temples, and her loyalists still lingered in the marble corridors of power. To the court, Thutmose was both a child of the gods and a man forged by restraint. For years he had smiled politely while Hatshepsut ruled in his stead, cloaking her reign in divine right and feminine cunning. Now those smiles had hardened into stone. The palace buzzed with cautious optimism, but behind every carved column, ears pressed against sandstone. Egypt was not unified, it was brittle. The high priest of Ammonius whispered loyalty to Thutmose while offering sacrifices in Hatshepsut's name. Nobles from Nubia and Cush brought tribute with honeyed words, but in their eyes lingered doubt. And in the Hall of Two Truths, courtiers plotted beneath false civility, masking ambition with concern. But it wasn't just whispers Thutmose feared. In the dead of night, a masked courtier moved silently through the lesser halls, robes whispering like snakeskin. He passed torchlit chambers and guards who did not see him. When he reached a hidden chamber near the Garden of Ake, he pulled from his cloak a scroll sealed with crimson wax, the sigil of the rebellious king of Kadesh. The message was short. A meeting had been called. The vassal kings of Canaan were gathering in defiance. War was coming, and one of them had found a serpent within the house of Horus willing to feed them Egypt's secrets. Back in his chamber, Thutmose stared at a bronze mirror, not at his reflection, but at what lay behind it. A hidden recess containing a sword his father once carried into battle. He unsheathed it slowly, as if drawing not just a weapon but an identity long denied. If Hatshepsut had ruled with the brushstroke, Thutmose would rule with the blade. The ghost of the queen may still haunt the stones, but the time for mourning was over. A new chapter had begun, and it would be written not in ink, but in blood. The city of Kadesh burned by torchlight, not in flames, but in fury. Beneath the vaulted ceiling of the House of Kings, the rebel lords of Canaan gathered in secret. They were princes, warlords, and opportunists, each with blood on their hands and ambition in their hearts. Some had once kissed the feet of Egypt's envoys. Now they plotted its undoing. At the head of the chamber stood King Shardana of Kadesh, wrapped in lion pelts and pride. His voice echoed like thunder through the candlelit hall. Egypt is weak. Its throne, newly inherited. Its court? Divided. Now is the hour. Grunts of agreement followed, but not all were convinced. Among them sat a figure cloaked in indigo robes, face obscured by a veil that shimmered like water in moonlight. Silent, observant, and known to none, until they spoke. There is a way, the figure said, unrolling a parchment with uncanny precision. Here Egypt's supply lines, every grain route, every caravan path from Thebes to Sinai. Cut these veins and the heart cannot beat. Gasps rippled through the room. How do you know this? Shardana asked. I served the vulture queen, the stranger replied. Now I serve her ghost. None knew whether it was metaphor or confession, but the information was too valuable to challenge. Already maps were being redrawn, armies reorganized. Treachery had become strategy. Meanwhile, across the desert, in the halls of Karnak, Pharaoh Thutmose III studied scrolls of a different kind. Reports from the northern provinces. Banditry, raids, cities late with tribute, traders whispering of Canaanite meetings in the hills. But one note chilled him. A woman once loyal has crossed the river to Kadesh. She knows things you cannot afford to lose. He crushed the papyrus in his fist. That night, he summoned his war council, generals, viziers, even a few whose loyalty he questioned. But all feared him more than they doubted him. They expected talk of defense. Instead, he spoke of invasion. We do not wait for betrayal to reach our gates, Thutmose said. We carry our vengeance to theirs. As the council dissolved into anxious murmurs, the pharaoh's scribe approached with another scroll, unsigned, unsealed, smuggled into the palace. Only one line was written in a trembling hand. Trust no one who knew her, not even those who loved you. The air in Thutmose's war tent was thick with the stench of sweat and oil lamps. Maps of Canaan, inked with calculated precision, were spread across the stone table. His generals stood around him, faces drawn tight with the fatigue of endless preparations. For days, the pharaoh had commanded them to study the landscape, to choose the perfect route into Canaan, to strike at Kadesh while the city slept. But every choice had a cost. Every path had its dangers. "We have 3 options, my pharaoh," said General Jehudi, his voice low but firm. He pointed to the first route on the map, a broad, well-traveled path through the desert plains. "This would take us directly to Kadesh. The safe, well-known, but it's also predictable. The Canaanites will expect it." Thutmose nodded but remained silent. His mind was already elsewhere. The second route, Jehudi continued, shifting to another section of the map, is through the mountain passes of Aruna. "It's narrow, difficult, but it's much harder to trace. It would give us the element of surprise." "And the third?" Thutmose asked, his eyes narrowing. Jehudi hesitated. "The third is a risk, my pharaoh. The old path, through the heart of the desert. A narrow gorge leading straight into the highlands, bypassing Kadesh entirely. We would surprise the enemy," but his voice faltered. "It is a path few have dared to travel. The journey would take us through a region known for its hostile terrain and unpredictable weather. Not even the gods know what lies in those parts." The silence that followed was heavy. Thutmose's eyes, sharp and unyielding, flickered between the 2 men at the table. General Jehudi, his most trusted, and Commander Mary, a fierce officer who had been with him through countless campaigns. "There is no time for safety," Thutmose said at last, his voice quiet but commanding. "We take the old path." A murmur rippled through the generals. Jehudi's brow furrowed. "My pharaoh, this path could spell disaster. Our supplies will be limited. The terrain is treacherous. The risk of ambush is—" "Do not tell me what is impossible, Jehudi," Thutmose interrupted, his tone icy. "Do not waste my time with what the cowardly speak. The gods speak through those who dare. We will move through the night. The element of surprise is our ally. I will not give it away." But as the war council dissolved, a flicker of doubt remained in the pharaoh's eyes. In the shadows of the tent, the shadow of the traitor loomed ever larger. Meanwhile, across the desert, in the heart of Kadesh, the masked courtier from the night before had already set in motion a plan of his own. With each step, he moved deeper into the heart of Egypt's power, a double agent without loyalty. He had seen Thutmose's decision. The old path would be their downfall. He made his way to King Shardana's private chambers in Kadesh, bearing a sealed letter. The king unfolded the scroll with a grin that bared his teeth. "Let them walk into the lion's mouth," Shardana whispered to the air, to no one in particular. "We will be waiting." The night was still, a heavy silence settling over the Egyptian camp. Pharaoh Thutmose III stood at the edge of his tent, staring out into the darkness. The moon hung low, casting a silver sheen over the landscape, painting everything with a ghostly light. The desert winds were calm, the usual howl muted by an unnatural stillness. It was as though the land itself held its breath, waiting. Tomorrow, they would begin the march through the narrow Aruna Pass into the very heart of the enemy's territory. The generals had protested, the priests had cautioned, but Thutmose had made his choice. It was not one of safety, but of necessity. Behind him, General Jehudi stood, hands clasped behind his back, his face unreadable. He had not spoken since the decision had been made. The old warrior understood the peril. They would be vulnerable, exposed on all sides, and once they entered the pass, retreat would be impossible. "My pharaoh," Jehudi finally spoke, his voice a low murmur in the silence, "you risk all we fought for. If we are discovered, we will not be." Thutmose cut him off, his voice firm yet tinged with a quiet, unsettling certainty. "We move by the falcon's wings, swift, unseen." The falcon was the emblem of his reign, the symbol of the god Horus, and to Thutmose, it was more than a simple bird. It was a reminder of his destiny, of the flight he must take, no matter how perilous. The gods had marked him, and there would carry him to victory. At dawn, the army began its march. The column stretched for miles, soldiers, chariots, and beasts of burden threading through the narrow pass like an endless ribbon of motion. Every footfall echoed in the silence, every rustling of leather and iron a reminder of the fragility of their position. The Aruna Pass was treacherous. A narrow, winding gorge flanked by towering cliffs, it had been chosen for its ability to conceal an army but not without cost. The air grew thick with dust, the sun rising high and unforgiving, and the heat began to take its toll. Even the bravest men began to falter under the weight of the march, their bodies aching from the constant uphill strain. But there was something else in the air, a subtle, unsettling energy. The falcon flew high above them, circling in the distance, a symbol of Thutmose's resolve. But there were whispers among the soldiers, the wind carried a scent of danger, something that did not belong. The pharaoh's spies, hidden within the ranks of the Canaanites, had already reported strange movements from the enemy. Shardana's forces were gathering, preparing, waiting. But where? Where would the ambush come from? Unseen by Thutmose's army, The Canaanite forces had begun their own preparations. The traitor who had once sworn loyalty to Egypt had made his way through the desert night, setting traps, preparing his forces for the moment when the Egyptians would be most vulnerable. He had no allegiance but to power, and in the quiet of the pass he would make his move. As the column advanced, the tension among the Egyptian ranks mounted. Every soldier felt it, the eyes upon them, the constant sense of danger. The moment they entered the pass, they would be trapped. There would be no retreat, no safe haven. It was a gamble, but it was a gamble Thutmose would take, for he knew that the falcon never hesitated. The pass grew narrower still, the cliffs looming over them like ancient sentinels. In the distance, Thutmose could see the flash of something, a glint of metal, perhaps, or a shadow moving just beyond his vision. He stood tall in his chariot, his eyes scanning the horizon. The moment of truth was close. The Egyptian army surged forward, their columns snaking through the Aruna Pass like a serpent in the sand. The narrow gorge pressed in on them from all sides, cliffs rising sharply to either side, casting long shadows that stretched across the path. The heat was stifling, the air thick with the dust of 1,000 marching feet. Yet, even in this desolation, the men moved with purpose. Pharaoh Thutmose III sat tall in his chariot, his face set with the grim determination of a man who had committed himself to fate. His mind was sharp, calculating. His eyes flicked from side to side, searching for the flicker of a shadow, the telltale sign of danger lurking just beyond his vision. Every moment, every step was calculated for a reason. He knew the risks. He had chosen this path, believing it would shield him from an enemy who thought they could outsmart him. He would see through their tricks. The generals had watched, warily, as their pharaoh led them forward. General Jehudi, though still reluctant, followed behind, casting nervous glances at the hills that flanked them. He had long known the dangers of overconfidence. Every second felt like a breath held too long. But they moved on, step by step, the trap they had expected failing to materialize. As the day wore on, the heat became unbearable. The army stopped for brief rests in the sparse shade, water skins passed from soldier to soldier. Their faces were grim, sweat dripping from their brows. But despite the tension, despite the growing sense that something wasn't right, the Canaanites had not struck. Where was the ambush? Where was the enemy? The sun had begun its descent when the answer came, not in the form of a battle, but in the form of a vision. The pharaoh's eyes caught a flash of movement, a bird of prey soaring high above. It was not a falcon, but an eagle, its wings cutting through the sky in tight, controlled arcs. Thutmose's mind went still for a moment, a chill crawling down his spine. The eagle wasn't a symbol of his reign. It was a sign from another, one who did not bow before Egypt's might. At that moment, a voice broke the silence. "My pharaoh," Jehudi said, stepping forward. His face was drawn tight, worry etched across his brow. "There are no signs of the enemy. There is no ambush. But something is not right. Our spies report movement on the hills, but no forces are in sight." Thutmose's eyes narrowed. He had expected a direct assault. Thunderous chariots, arrows filling the sky, soldiers rushing from the cliffs. Yet there was nothing. The stillness stretched on, suffocating. The pharaoh's gaze hardened. A plan was unfolding, one that was far more devious than the expected clash of armies. "Perhaps they have laid their trap elsewhere," Thutmose said coldly. "Or perhaps they wish us to believe there is no danger. Either way, we march forward." The pharaoh's voice echoed with the authority of a king who had lived through too many battles to fall to simple tricks. Still, in the back of his mind, the suspicion gnawed at him. The tension in his chest was more than just the weight of the sun. It was the weight of a question. Had they underestimated the enemy? But Thutmose could not afford hesitation, not now. The will of the gods burned within him, driving him forward. The Egyptian army pressed on, despite the overwhelming sense of uncertainty. But the longer they marched, the more the silence became oppressive. The narrow path was suffocating, there was nowhere to retreat, nowhere to hide. The cliffs, once a shield, now felt like a trap. And then, as the last light of day vanished behind the mountains, Thutmose heard it. A distant sound, a deep rumble that seemed to come from beneath the earth itself. It wasn't the clash of weapons. It wasn't the rumble of chariot wheels. It was the sound of something moving, something shifting, as though the earth were about to swallow them whole. Thutmose's eyes snapped wide. He turned sharply to General Jehudi, who was already looking at him, fear flashing in his eyes. "The pass, it's collapsing." The moon had long since sunk beneath the horizon, leaving the Egyptian army to march under the bruised sky of early dawn. The air had cooled, but the weight of anticipation lingered like a dark cloud. The Aruna Pass had delivered them to this point, a narrow, winding stretch of land where the walls of rock seemed to close in, suffocating them with every step. Thutmoses III felt the tension building with every passing moment. He could feel the eyes of his men on him, the weight of their expectations heavy upon his shoulders. But it wasn't the army he was most concerned about. It was the fear gnawing at his mind, the fear that the enemy's silence wasn't the result of incompetence but part of a more insidious plan. As they reached the narrowest part of the pass, the sky shifted. A distant rumble sounded again, this time louder, more insistent. The ground trembled slightly beneath their feet as though something massive was preparing to move. Thutmoses' instincts were on edge. He raised his hand, signaling for the column to halt. His generals exchanged uneasy glances, their eyes flicking from side to side, waiting for something, anything to happen. "Stay sharp," Thutmose muttered under his breath. The moment stretched long as the Egyptian soldiers braced themselves for an attack that never came. Instead, the sound of grinding metal cut through the stillness. Thutmoses' heart skipped a beat as he realized that the sound wasn't from the enemy. It was from his own forces. The chariots. From his vantage point, he could see the dust rising in the distance, the shapes of men scrambling to make sense of the sudden confusion. What had happened? "General Jehudi," Thutmose shouted, his voice cutting through the air. "Report." The old warrior moved swiftly to the pharaoh's side, his face pale. "The chariots, they've been sabotaged, my lord. Axles are broken. The horses have been spooked." It was a blow to the heart of the Egyptian army. Chariots were their most potent weapon, their symbol of supremacy. Without them, they were vulnerable, slow, and exposed. Thutmoses' blood ran cold. Someone had known. Someone had planned for this moment. And now the enemy would strike. "Form ranks." Thutmose barked. "Get those chariots out of the way. Archers to the front. Infantry, prepare for a fight." The order was swift, but it was too late. From the cliffs above, the first wave of enemy forces descended. The Canaanites had hidden in the rocks, lying in wait, their ambush executed with brutal precision. The Egyptians had walked straight into their trap. Chariots crashed into one another, horses rearing in panic as arrows rained down from the cliffs. The Canaanites moved with the precision of a well-oiled machine, coordinated, ruthless, and merciless. The Egyptian army was thrown into chaos, their lines breaking, their formation disintegrating under the pressure of the sudden onslaught. In the midst of the chaos, Thutmose fought to maintain his composure. He pushed forward, rallying his men, barking orders, but inside, the growing realization settled like a stone in his stomach. This was not a normal battle. This was a betrayal. He turned to Jehudi, his eyes burning with a new understanding. This wasn't just a plan. It was a message. The general nodded grimly. "It's not the Canaanites who've done this alone. There's someone within our own ranks." Thutmose's gaze hardened. The treachery was far deeper than he had ever imagined. The traitors were not just outside the walls. They were within, wearing the same armor, fighting under the same flag. In the midst of the fray, a chariot bearing the royal banner cut through the confusion. Thutmose's heart skipped as he saw the captain, his trusted ally, one of his most loyal men, fighting fiercely at the front. But as the chariot drew near, a sharp, unexpected movement caught his eye. The captain's armor gleamed in the sunlight, but there was something wrong. His shield was positioned strangely, as if he were hiding something. Thutmose's instincts flared, and before he could make sense of it, the captain's chariot veered off course, charging into the chaos of the Canaanite forces. The pharaoh's heart pounded as realization struck. "Traitor!" he roared, his voice carrying across the battlefield. The captain had deserted him, had sided with the enemy. But the true shock was yet to come. As the traitor's chariot disappeared into the fray, Thutmose's eyes were drawn to something that had fallen from the captain's hand. A ring, unmistakable in its design. It was a royal seal, one that had been given to a noblewoman he had once trusted, one he had thought long exiled from the court. The pieces were falling into place. The battle raged around him, but the true battle, the one for his heart, his throne, and his very soul, was just beginning. The siege of Megiddo had begun. The Egyptian army, victorious on the battlefield but severely weakened, had encircled the city. But the city's walls, tall and impenetrable, would not fall easily. The soldiers had dug in, preparing for a long war of attrition. As days bled into weeks, the rhythm of the siege became unbearable, constant pounding against the city gates, the grinding of wheels, the endless watch of the sentries. But it was not the external enemy that tormented Pharaoh Thutmose III. It was the rot within his own camp. A treacherous seed had been planted, and now it spread through the very heart of his forces. Thutmose had been walking the thin line between triumph and ruin since the moment he had led his army through the Aruna Pass. The Canaanites were broken, their forces scattered and demoralized. Yet, as he stood at the helm of his encampment, surrounded by loyal generals and his trusted soldiers, the pharaoh could not shake the feeling that something darker was at work. The whispers were growing louder. Days before, an assassin had attempted to strike at his life. A failed attempt that had left Thutmose unscathed but shaken. The dagger hidden beneath his pillow had been a message, one that carried a singular word etched into its hilt: usurper. Thutmose had known the politics of Egypt were never simple. His rise to power had been hard-earned, fought in the shadow of his stepmother Hatshepsut's legacy. But this was something else entirely. This was a betrayal at the highest level, an act that cut deeper than any battle wound. Inside the tent, Thutmose paced, his face a mask of fury and exhaustion. His generals and advisors had assembled, standing in tight formation, but their eyes remained fixed on the ground, careful not to meet their pharaoh's gaze. The silence was suffocating. "Someone among us seeks my downfall," Thutmose finally spoke, his voice low but sharp. "We are surrounded by enemies, yes, but there is a snake within our ranks, coiled and waiting to strike." General Jehudi, ever vigilant, stepped forward, his brow furrowed with concern. "My lord, we know this. The assassination attempt was the work of someone close to you. But who? We must root them out, for if we do not, the siege will be the least of our worries." The pharaoh's eyes burned as he fixed his gaze on Jehudi. "I know, I feel it, but every person I trust is now under suspicion." As the days dragged on, the pressure mounted. The soldiers whispered of a strange unease that had taken hold of the camp. The food stores were running low. The water was contaminated. Supplies went missing without explanation. A sickness had begun to spread, and men who once fought with honor now looked over their shoulders in fear. Thutmose's suspicion grew, festering like an open wound. One night, a desperate cry pierced the stillness. A soldier had found something, a note carefully concealed under a stack of supplies, sealed with a blood-red mark. The message was brief, but its implications were clear. "The enemy is within the gates. The city will fall when you least expect it." Thutmose knew he could no longer trust anyone, not even his most loyal men. As the days passed and the siege continued, his mental state began to deteriorate. He would not sleep, could not rest. Every sound, every movement seemed to be a threat. Was it the enemy, or was it one of his own? Late one night, after a particularly heated council meeting, Thutmose stood alone in his tent. His hands shook as he looked over a map of the city, trying to focus, but the weight of uncertainty was too much to bear. Every decision now felt like a gamble. A figure entered without warning. "Pharaoh," the voice was soft, familiar. Thutmose spun around, his heart hammering in his chest. It was Jehudi. The general had returned to check on the pharaoh, his expression unreadable. The shadows of the tent seemed to stretch and warp around him. Thutmose knew Jehudi well. He was a man of few words, but every word he spoke carried weight. "My lord," Jehudi said quietly, stepping closer. "I've just received word. There's movement among the men. Unexplained movement. Some of the soldiers are taking matters into their own hands, acting without orders." Thutmose's eyes narrowed. "What do you mean?" "The whispers have become more dangerous, my lord. Someone is feeding them. I believe we may have a spy as someone close to you." A chill ran through Thutmose's veins. It was no longer about a single traitor. The rot had spread. A spy was feeding information from inside the pharaoh's own camp. It was the perfect way to fracture his army, to weaken him when he was closest to victory. "I have no choice," Thutmose murmured, the decision suddenly clear in his mind. "I must act before it's too late." That night, a purge began. The soldiers who had shown signs of disloyalty were silently removed from the camp, their fates sealed in the shadows of the night. The general's plan was swift and brutal, rooting out the conspirators before they could poison the whole army. But Thutmose knew that even with their deaths, the damage had been done. The trust between the pharaoh and his men was shattered beyond repair. And somewhere, in the dark heart of the Egyptian camp, the real enemy was still waiting. The siege at Megiddo had stretched on for months. The Egyptian army had grown thin, its spirit fraying at the edges. The soldiers, once brimming with resolve, now counted the days with the hollow knowledge that they were trapped in a game of attrition, their morale slipping with each passing moment. But inside the royal tent, it wasn't the physical hardship that weighed heaviest on Pharaoh Thutmose III, it was the knowledge that the real battle had long since moved beyond the city's walls. Now it was a battle for his throne, his life, and his very legacy. The assassination attempt had rattled him, but it had also steeled his resolve. The would-be assassin had been caught, his throat slit by the very guards who had once sworn loyalty to the pharaoh. But even as Thutmose pondered the identity of the conspirator, the growing realization gnawed at him. This was not just a lone traitor, but a conspiracy within his inner circle, a deep-rooted network of betrayal. The time for subtlety had passed. Thutmose had to act swiftly. One fateful night, a blood-curdling scream echoed across the Egyptian camp, a scream that would haunt the pharaoh's dreams for years to come. His guards rushed to the source, only to find the lifeless body of a prince, one of Thutmose's closest allies, sprawled on the cold ground. His breath had been stolen in the night, a dagger buried deep in his chest. The prince was none other than Amenemhat, the young noble who had grown up alongside Thutmose, more brother than servant. They had fought together in the early days of Thutmose's reign, forged a bond that seemed unbreakable. But now he was dead, and the pharaoh stood frozen, unable to comprehend the enormity of the betrayal. The assassin had struck swiftly, but it was the aftermath that would tear the pharaoh's soul apart. The prince's final moments were shrouded in mystery. No one could account for where Amenemhat had been before his death, nor could they explain the single enigmatic clue left behind: a ring. It was a golden ring intricately engraved with the symbol of Thutmose's own dynasty, but it wasn't the design that drew the pharaoh's attention, it was the name carved inside the band. A name he recognized all too well. The name belonged to Anip, a noblewoman who had once been his lover. A woman whom he had exiled years ago after a betrayal that had shaken the very foundations of his rule. Anip had been a figure of beauty and cunning, a woman whose influence had reached deep into the royal court. When their affair ended in scandal, she had been sent away, her name erased from the annals of Egypt's history. Now her ring was found on the dead prince, her presence once again inscribed on the tragedy that had befallen the pharaoh. Thutmose's mind raced as he pieced together the fragments of the puzzle. The prince's death was no accident. This was no random assassination. Amenemhat had been a pawn in a game much larger than Thutmose had realized. A game that reached all the way back to Anip, a woman who had never truly left his life, despite his efforts to erase her from it. But why would Anip involve herself in such a scheme? What had she hoped to gain by aligning herself with the prince? In the days that followed, whispers began to circulate, rumors of a plot, an alliance between Anip and a faction of nobles who sought to bring down the pharaoh. They were tired of his reign, tired of his leadership, and they believed that with the right push, they could replace him with someone more pliable, someone who could be controlled. The pieces were coming together, but the full picture was still out of reach. Thutmose knew one thing for certain: his trust in the people around him had been shattered, and he could no longer afford to be merciful. The very foundations of his rule were crumbling, and if he didn't act swiftly, he would lose everything. As the days turned into weeks, the pharaoh began to prepare for what would come next. He could not let Amenemhat's death be in vain. His death had been a message, and it was a message that he had to answer. Thutmose summoned his most loyal advisors and generals, each of them sworn to him by blood and by loyalty. They gathered in the royal tent, their faces grim, their eyes fixed on the pharaoh. "We will root out the conspirators, one by one," Thutmose declared, his voice cold and resolute. "This battle is not just for Megiddo, it is for Egypt itself, and I will not fall." As his words echoed in the silence, he knew that the road ahead would be filled with darkness. The siege would end, but the war for his throne was just beginning. The city of Megiddo loomed like a fortress of stone against the burning Canaanite sky, its high walls a grim reminder of the strength that stood between Thutmose III and his ultimate victory. The siege had lasted for months, wearing down the Egyptian forces with each passing day. Hunger, disease, and morale had all taken their toll, but the pharaoh's mind remained sharp, his resolve unbroken. Yet beneath the surface of the slow, grinding war, something darker was stirring. Thutmose could feel it. Thutmose's generals were skeptical, but the pharaoh's confidence was absolute. This, he knew, was the moment that would turn the tide. They would play the Canaanites like a chessboard, and the gates of Megiddo would be their downfall. As the Egyptians began their retreat, the Canaanites stirred. The false signals were taken as the pharaoh's surrender. Inside the city, a sense of victory began to build. The commanders of the Canaanite forces felt the taste of triumph on their lips. They believed that the pharaoh had been defeated by their siege. They were wrong. Hours passed. The Egyptian forces marched away, and the Canaanites, overconfident and drunk on the illusion of victory, made their move. They opened the gates, and that was the trap. As soon as the gates of Megiddo creaked open, Thutmose's forces returned, swift, silent, and deadly. The soldiers poured back into the city like a flood of vengeance, pushing past the surprised and disoriented Canaanites. The pharaoh's chariots, once hidden, now emerged in full force, charging at the heart of the city with a ferocity that sent shockwaves through the enemy ranks. It was not a battle, it was a reckoning. The Canaanites, unprepared for such a swift reversal, found themselves trapped inside the very city they had thought was their prize. The pharaoh's forces swept through the gates in a tidal wave of fury, and the city was filled with the sound of chaos and clashing steel. The battle that followed was swift and brutal. The Canaanite forces, stunned by the sudden turn of events, were scattered. The walls of Megiddo had been breached from within, and the defenders had no choice but to fight with desperation. Thutmose's army, revitalized by their surprise attack, cut through the Canaanites like a scythe through wheat. The pharaoh himself stood at the forefront, his chariot leading the charge. His eyes blazed with the fire of vengeance as he pushed deeper into the heart of the city. It was a triumph that would echo through the ages, not just because of the victory itself, but because of the genius of the move that had preceded it. But even as the city fell and the Canaanites were thrown into disarray, Thutmose knew that his victory had come at a cost. The gates of Megiddo had been breached, but the gates to his own heart, those of trust and loyalty, had been shattered long ago. As the final remnants of the Canaanite resistance crumbled, the pharaoh stood atop the ramparts, looking over the city he had conquered. The battle was over, but the war for his throne was far from finished. His mind turned to those who had conspired against him, to those who had sought his downfall. And as the dust of the battlefield settled, Thutmose knew one thing for certain: this victory was just the beginning. The true reckoning would come when he turned his attention to those who had betrayed him from within. The dust of battle still lingered over Megiddo, a grim reminder of the chaos that had unfolded in the streets. The city, once a stronghold of rebellion, now lay in ruins, a testament to Thutmose III's strategic genius and the raw power of his unrelenting will. Yet as the smoke cleared and the cries of the wounded echoed across the battlefield, the pharaoh stood at the pinnacle of his victory with a heart weighed down by the burden of betrayal. The gates of Megiddo had been breached, the Canaanite forces broken, and their king, his greatest enemy, captured. But for Thutmose, the real battle had never been against the armies of Kadesh. It had always been against the treachery lurking within his own court, in the hearts of those who had once sworn allegiance to him. With the Canaanites subdued and the city of Megiddo in his hands, Thutmose turned his focus to the traitors who had nearly cost him everything. The men and women who had conspired to bring him down, those who had believed his strength was faltering and his throne ready to fall. The time for mercy had passed. He summoned his trusted advisors and generals to the royal tent. Each of them stood with a mix of solemn respect and quiet fear, knowing that the pharaoh's patience had run out. The traitors would be punished, and the question was no longer who would die, but how. The first to be dragged before Thutmose was General Bebi, a man who had once been his closest ally, the man who had commanded his armies in countless victories. But now, Bebi stood accused of conspiring with the Canaanites, of betraying his pharaoh for the promise of power in the new order that would rise after his fall. His hands shook as he knelt before the pharaoh, his once proud eyes filled with guilt and fear. Thutmose's gaze was cold and unyielding. The general's fate was sealed. "No mercy," Thutmose declared, his voice hard as granite. "This is the price of treachery." Bebi's life was taken swiftly, his death marking the first of many. One by one, the traitors were dragged before the pharaoh. Some begged for their lives, pleading for mercy with words that rang hollow in Thutmose's ears. Others stood silent, their faces blank with the realization that they had lost everything in their pursuit of power. As each traitor met their end, the pharaoh's mind wandered back to the earlier days of his reign. He thought of the dream he had once had, the dream of unity and peace for Egypt, the dream of leading the kingdom to glory. But now, that dream seemed distant, replaced by the harsh reality of a ruler who could no longer afford to be soft, no longer afford to show weakness. His path had been carved in blood, and the price of power was always steep. But as the last of the conspirators fell, Thutmose knew that his reign was far from over. Megiddo had been a pivotal moment, but the challenges ahead were far greater. The enemies he had defeated were only one part of the equation. There were other forces gathering on the horizon, forces that would challenge Egypt's dominance, challenge his rule, and threaten everything he had fought for. As the last traitor was executed, Thutmose stood alone on the ramparts of Megiddo looking out over the city he had conquered. His army celebrated, but Thutmose's heart was heavy. His victory was complete, but it was tainted by the cost of betrayal. His legacy had been written in blood, but was it worth it? Would history remember him as a great pharaoh, or as a ruler consumed by distrust and vengeance? Just as he pondered the future, a shape appeared on the horizon. A solitary figure standing against the rising sun. Thutmose's gaze narrowed. A falcon soared overhead, circling the battlefield as though it was searching for something that Thutmose couldn't yet see. The bird flew eastward, vanishing into the distance. Thutmose's heart skipped a beat. There, beyond the horizon, lay the future. A kingdom in the east, one that would one day rise to challenge Egypt's supremacy. Thutmose had fought for his throne, but the true test of his legacy was yet to come. The question remained, would the pharaoh's empire endure, or would it crumble under the weight of ambition and betrayal? As the sun dipped below the horizon, Thutmose III, the pharaoh of Egypt, stood resolute, knowing that his name would be etched into history. But what kind of history would it be?